Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance within the Sumy region in the north, across the Usk River line in the northern parts of the Donetsk region, near Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, east of Pokrovsk, and to the southwest of the city. The Russian advances total approximately 43 square kilometers since the last update. Starting out in the Sumy region in the north, the Russians have managed to advance beyond that of Kindrativka, getting control over forest lines and fields, the remaining parts of Andrivka, and continuing the advance south of Oleksivka. The Russians have reached the outskirts of Mala Kurchakivka, which is the next town along the roads here to the south, where the Russian goal is to cut off the intersection supplying the Ukrainian positions in the direction of Yunikivka and behind it. The Russians are also covering the flank of the road, moving down south towards Khotin, which is additional target to cut off the western flank of the Ukrainian forces in the section of the front line. The Russians are launching a combined assault from both flanks of the intersection, while at the same time they have managed to advance within the central parts south of Andrivka into a three-pronged attack from the western, eastern, and central parts. The Ukrainian positions are now being threatened from three separate directions, and these three directions are all well connected. A Russian push to the south of Oleksivka will allow them to gain control of this intersection just north of Melakurchakivka, which will allow them to connect with the forces in the central parts, and the forces in the central parts moving through to gain control over this intersection here as well, will allow them to push further westwards. And with a push down that road, we can see that all three are connected here to the north of the towns, allowing for the Russians to divert their forces between the three separate directions. Not to mention that we are currently in the summer period, which means that the Russians can also advance with heavy vehicles through the fields. The Russians have numerous options for which direction they want to attack these settlements from. We can see that the main goal of the Russians will be to gain control over the highway intersection. To gain control over this area, they would need to push through Mala Kurchakivka as the fastest road, the central parts down towards Basarivka in the north, or the western road through Khotin and then cutting it off from the rear. The obvious road, the most direct road, the quickest one, is directly from and through Mala Kurchakivka and towards Basarivka, which is the town that is directly connected to the intersection. The Ukrainians have some roads through the forest patch areas, but these are much more difficult to use compared to the main highway. The Russians gaining control over the intersection will significantly limit the supplies of the Ukrainian forces in the entire area here northeast of the city itself. From this we can see that the Russians will look to have Pisarivka as their main target. However, they also need to secure the flanks if they want to have a solid control over the intersection. Therefore, the Russians would need to gain control over Mala Kurchakivka and Khotin. They may even launch operations towards gaining full control over both towns before targeting Pisarivka directly. The most likely option we are seeing right now, based on the developments, is that the Russians are looking to storm all three settlements at the same time from the eastern, western, and directly head on through the center towards Pisarivka. The objective of the Russians is to make use of the numerical superiority and their firepower advantage to spread out the Ukrainian forces and spread out their own forces, allowing for a wide attack where the Ukrainians would have one single line of defense, where if they targeted in one direction, the Ukrainians could establish multiple. The Russians currently have significant momentum with their large captures of territory. We see this based on the fact that this video has recently been released, and this shows an alleged 2 Abrams tanks being captured in the Sumy region. The Russian soldiers here managed to overrun the Ukrainians, leaving these 2 Abrams tanks almost entirely intact, as the Ukrainians were forced to abandon them. The 47th Mechanized Brigade continues to defend this section of the front line using the Abrams tanks, yet they are not only unable to stop the Russian advances, they are even getting overrun, which shows the difficult situation the Ukrainian forces are in the section of the front line. They simply do not have the necessary manpower and firepower to defend it, as the Ukrainians are focusing their efforts elsewhere, trying to re-enter the Kursk region and to launch counterattacks in other sections of the front line, where the momentum is also in favor of the Russians, with large advances there as well. The Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Yablonivka, as well gain control over the road connecting the east and the west, as they encroach on Vereshina here to the west of Yablonivka to gain control over the first lines and the fields here in between the two towns. The Russians will here look to cut off the western road here west of Yunikivka. With control over Yablonivka, they can drive to the south and cut it off from there. This is one step to limiting the supplies to Yunikivka itself, while the western push would be to cut off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces in this entire section of the front line. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, in the northern parts of the Donetsk region, the Russians made 3 separate advances. To the west of Rydkudub, they continued advancing along the river line, where they're looking to gain control over the eastern bank of it. The objective is to secure the northern and western flanks of Rydkudub, to establish it as a supply hub for further offensive operations in the direction of Karpivka, as fighting continues within the town as well. At the same time, the Russians pushed beyond Lipovit to flank Zelena Dolina from the north, gaining control over the forest patches and forest lines to the north of the town, and at the same time they launched a flanking maneuver from the south, which allowed them to gain fire control over the road leading into Zelena Dolina. With this, the Russians have operationally encircled Zelena Dolina. The Russians will here look to gain control over the town with this pincer maneuver, attacking Zelena Dolina on both flanks. This will allow the Russians to gain control over the town and open the road to the next town, which is that of Shandri Holove, which is an important intersection and logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces in the Liman direction. Liman has 2 main roads from the western direction. One goes through Shandri Holove, the second goes through Dobresheve. If the Russians gain control of both of these towns, the Ukrainians would be completely cut off from the western direction, having only the cross-river supply roads from Slovyansk and Siversk to supply their forces. If the Russians continuously strike these crossings, they can operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces within Liman and this entire section of the front line. Therefore, the Russians will now be ignoring the eastern section and focusing on the western parts to cut off the supply lines and operationally encircle Liman, for the objective to completely starve out the Ukrainian forces in this entire section of the front line. We can see clear similarities between this section of the front line and the current objective of the Russian forces here, with the ones in the Sumy region, where the Russians are having a much larger operations and much more ambitious targets and goals compared to earlier. We can see that the Russians are here looking to speed up their capture of territory and not just focus on grinding down the Ukrainian forces. To the south, here northwest of Chesev Yar, the Russians made a small advance, cutting off the road connecting the Ukrainian forces in the north with the ones in the outskirts of Chesev Yar. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the fortified positions here northwest of Chesev Yar. Following the capture of the apartment complex area, the Ukrainians are now being pushed back away from the city itself. To the south of this, the Russians managed to gain control over the pig farms here in the east of Azoria, gaining control over both of the farm areas and aligning the front line to the west of Romanivka, with Azoria gaining control over the roads between the two towns. With this, the Russians will now be moving onwards towards Oleksandro Kalinove. As they continue storming Yablonivka from the west, the Russians managed to gain control over several fortified positions and forest lines to the northwest of the town, while advancing within the western parts of the town, both in the southern and northern parts, gaining control over the road across the Bichok River, connecting their forces in the north and the south as they continued offensive operations towards the fortified positions to the north of Yablonivka, while advancing within the town itself. Russians are also looking to advance towards the town from the south. With the recent advances to the south of Yablonivka, the Russians are planning a wide advance in the northern and southern flanks of the town to gain control over it and the fortified positions leading through the TO504 highway in the direction of Stepanivka and the city of Kashantinivka itself. At the same time, we can likely see a restart of offensive operations in the northern direction, with this recent push by the Russians in the northern direction, both in the direction of Yablonivka to gain control over the fortified positions, but also to the north of Shevchenko, Persia, where the Russians are slowly advancing on the western flank of Popiv Yar, widening the front line to allow the Russians to start offensive operations towards Poltavka and Rusin Yar, without having the Ukrainian forces focusing and targeting one specific direction. At the same time, it also opened up the road for Kupcheve, which is the final town the Russians will look to gain control of ahead of the defensive line. The next parts are all part of the defensive line here to the northeast of Pokrovsk. Based on this, we can see that the Russians are moving through the area in between Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, where the Ukrainians have much less fortified positions, much more open fields, and less concentration of forces, urban areas, and fortifications. This allows the Russians to have larger advances with less resistance and improve their tactical position for the defensive lines of the Ukrainians, striking Ukrainian supply lines, and the operational encirclement of both Kostiantynivka and Pokrovsk. To the southwest, the Russians have secured the southeastern parts of Novomykolaiivka yet again, and they've managed to fight back Ukrainian counterattacks towards the road connecting Novomykolaiivka and Kotlyarivka here in the southern parts. The Ukrainians continue to attempt to launch counterattacks to cut off the supply lines of the Russians as they continue offensive operations towards the border area, as these are the final positions of the Ukrainians ahead of the Dnipropetrovsk region. However, the Russians have managed to turn the momentum and have managed to secure the southwest of Bogdanivka, the southeast of Novomykolaiivka, and also now the northeast of Oleksivka with additional pushes. The Russians southwest of Bogdanivka continue advancing along the roads to reach the Dnipropetrovsk region from the southern flank and to expand the zone of control to the northern flank of the Oleksivka-Dashnet defensive line of the Ukrainians, attempting to flank these fortified positions from the rear. This is combined with assaults here to the northeast of Oleksivka, where the Russians gain control over additional forest lines in their attempts to secure the northern flank of this defensive line and flank the Ukrainian fortifications from their weak point. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over this entire pocket connected with their recent advances in the direction of Vodorodne and Bahatir in the south. Gaining control over the highway itself will allow the Russians to make use of that same highway for offensive operations towards Novopavlivka in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and also to secure the northern flank of their operations to the south along the highway from Konstantinopel towards Kumar, where the Russians also managed to advance along the Mokryali river line, gaining control over the fortified positions and the intersection here to the south, where they're looking to gain control over the road connecting up to Kumar from the south. Combining that with an assault from the east in the direction of Vodorodne, the Russians will be able to pincer Kumar from the southern and northern flanks. Based on all of this, we can see that the Russians have been continuing the offensive operations all across the front line. Although the past update did not have a lot of Russian advances, this one makes up for it, as we can see the average over today and yesterday is approximately 50 square kilometers in favor of the Russians, or an average of 25 square kilometers a day, which has been the general trend over the past few months. All this talk about a Russian summer offensive had me thinking about a statement from the Russian Minister of Defense, Belousov. He was instated as the Minister of Defense in May of 2024. At the end of the year, he did the yearly summary of the war in Ukraine, which the Minister of Defense does every year in Russia. During that speech, December 16th, 2024, he stated that the Russian army set its goals for 2025 to liberate the entirety of the territory of the four regions, which means the entirety of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk, as the majority of Luhansk has already been captured. Approximately 100 square kilometers remains in the forested areas here in the Liman section of the front line. So based on this, we can see that the Russians would need to capture approximately 5,000 square kilometers in each of these locations, totaling to approximately 15,000 square kilometers that they need to gain control of. I believe that it is currently pretty obvious that no peace treaty will come through that will allow for this to happen in favor of the Russians gaining control over these four regions. Instead, it is looking very likely that if this is going to happen, it is going to happen through offensive operations and military actions on the fields. This raises the question, will the Russians launch a large-scale offensive operation to gain control over these three regions, or will they go back on their words during the December 2024 update? Based on the reputation of Belousov, he is known in Russian society to be a man of his words. This means that he is putting his own reputation on the line with that statement, which makes no sense unless he believes it is attainable. And it is only attainable not through the continuous grinding down of Ukrainian forces and destroying their army across the front line, but by switching their objective not just to destroy the Ukrainian army, but to gain territory. We're currently seeing that the Russians are on their way to gain full control over the Donetsk region. However, the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions are another story. We can see clearly that neither of these regions have had much movement over the past years, which means we will either see a Russian offensive to gain control over these regions where they will attack them head on, or the Russians will plan on gaining control over other regions to exchange them for these regions in a potential peace deal. If the Russians have something to exchange for these 4 regions, it's very likely that the Ukrainians will agree, on the contrary to having nothing to offer for them except peace. In either case, this all points to not just additional border incursions by the Russian forces, but instead a large-scale offensive by the Russians where they plan to capture thousands of square kilometers in a small portion of time. This indicates a large offensive that will take place either in the northern section of the front line or in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. Potentially even both. In either case, I'll leave that for an analysis in the future. That is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.